Central Coast Club for having me on tonight. I must confess, I am a bit of a Luddite when it comes to modern technology. So if things start to go wrong, please put your hand up and let me know that my internet's bad or anything else. But yeah, I guess where to start would be about me. Why not? I started flying in 2009, and I actually started flying on the Central Coast, which is where I did my initial part of training. So Catherine Hill Bay and Foresters were my first flights. And what can I say? I love flying as much now as I did when I first started. And the thing that really appeals to me about paragliding the most is there are so many different aspects that you can pursue. So when I first started flying, you know, I was 10 years younger and my hair was darker. And for me, the focus was acro. So I was trying to do, you know, silly, strange things in the air and terrify myself. And I went down that road for 5 years. And then once I had children and I didn't have the time to focus on acro, I started going down the road of cross country and then hike and fly and speed flying. So it seems like this is one of the sports where you can chase one discipline for a year or two and then switch. And even though it is in the same umbrella of the same sport, it's a totally new fix, a totally new sort of addiction to scratch at your skin. So, you know, I think that we're all incredibly blessed that we've chosen this pastime to you know, get away from our family and our kids. And, you know, what better thing to do than do 360s in the sky and watch the world sort of slip away. So that's kind of about me. I don't really like bragging. So I don't know. What's the first step you want to talk about, Guy? Would you like to talk about coastal flying or tips?
Yeah, so Roger, my question is that when did you lose your hair? Was it acro, next seat, or was it kids?
I think it was German wife was the initial thing, and then kids are a short second.
Yeah. Let's start with coastal, because we've got a lot of coastal flyers here. Why don't you reminisce about some of your best coastal flights, some learnings and techniques?
So I strongly believe that coastal flying can teach you, you know, almost everything to do regarding paragliding knowledge and skill. But when we talk about tips, I think it's important to break it down into the two categories of novice tips and advanced tips, because one is for one and the other is, you know, for a few years in the sport. So my top tips for new pilots coming in to the sport that have just been PG2 is to fly as much as you can. Now, this is easier on the coast if you've learnt on the coast. And I always suggest people learn at a school that is similar to the environment you learn in, because flying in the mountains is very different to flying on the coast. But if you live on the coast, regardless of where you've done your schooling, you should really focus on getting as much time in your local environment as possible, because what we are doing is an apprenticeship into flight, and the more experience and the more time you have doing it, the better you will become and the safer you become. So my top tips for newer pilots would be, first of all, get there and get amongst the gear. And the ways to do that is, first of all, to learn the weather. So coastal flying is very easy to get the weather predictions and forecasts right, because we don't need to worry about what's happening at wind and altitude. All we need to know is surface winds. So you should be liaising with your club, but I know the Central Coast has a great mentor system. But you want to be liaising with your club and find good people to fly with. But then you also want to be monitoring at least 2 good weather forecasting stations and look at it every day and get to the stage where you can see where that flying window is. Because in summer, especially in Sydney and I think on the Central Coast, we might get 5, if not 6 out of 7 days where there is a window to fly. And the better you are at reading when those windows are, the more experience that you would get in the sky. Once you've learned when to be at the right spot at the right time, the next thing is to prepare for the flight. And that comes from ground handling. So especially for the guys that have learnt in mountain and inland flying sites, typically they've been taking off in light winds, variable from 2 knots to 8 knots. But it's pretty rare they take off in strong winds of 12 or 14 knots. So look at the weather forecast, learn when to be at the right spot at the right time, and then also prepare your skills that you can take off in the correct weather window. So if you get to flying sites and it's too windy, it may be too windy on launch, but it won't be too windy at the beach or too windy at a park nearby. And that's a great time to improve your ground handling skills. Because really, the most danger and risk we face is at takeoff and launch. So if you can predict what the weather's doing at the right time and have the skills to deal with it, well, that's a lot of the risk that you will face as a new pilot done. And that's stuff you can all prepare with before your feet even leave the ground. After that, flying tips for a new pilot is just to get out in the air as much as you can. The more you fly, the more you will experience, the more you will develop your own skills, and the safer you'll be. How did that sound, Guy? I'm getting some reverb on my computer. Is the internet okay?
Yours
It
is
sounds
fine.
wonderful on our side.
Actually, it's coming from your side, Guy. It's so we're getting a reflection. So it's if you can mute when you're not talking. The person that can't hear the feedback is where it's coming from. So.
Okay, great. Well, I'll just keep talking, and unless I see people waving at me or mouthing, then I will presume that you can all hear me okay. So that's my coastal flying tips for new pilots. But then you get to the stage where coastal flying is actually, once you've got the fundamentals down, it's very easy and it's very enjoyable. So you want to do it more and more. And then if we continue along the same track of just rocking up, taking off, ridge soaring for half an hour, however long that may be, and landing, really the only skills you're developing are the launch and landing, because the beating back and forth is just similar behavior that you've already mastered. So my tips for pilots with, intermediate to advanced piloting skills is to not get complacent and just fly back and forth the ridge, but to set yourself challenges each time you fly. So when the conditions are good and the sites aren't overcrowded, the best way to do that is to do multiple launches and landings. Now, if you have a site that's available to top land, there's no better skill for a glider control than a pilot that can come back over launch, match the glider's airspeed to the wind speed, hover down, touch down. You don't have to pull the glider down, but that multiple times is worth thousands of hours of going back and forth across the same ridge with no new challenges. So I'd say the first thing for the sort of the intermediate to the advanced pilot coastal tips would be to challenge themselves and set themselves a task each time. And that could be 5 top landings per session. Or if it's a light wind day, you could mark an area on the beach. You don't have to physically do it. You could just say, okay, I'm going to land in the first third of that area, and then take off in the light wind, and then set yourself the challenge of setting up the landing approach and landing in that area. It could be that you are fortunate enough to have sections of a cliff where you can top land in multiple places. And it might be to try and land somewhere different. But each time you're there, you want to be setting yourself a flight path. I'm not just rocking up to a flying site saying I'm going to fly for 40 minutes and go home. It should be more than that. I'm going to fly to this location and back, or I'm going to go as far away from the lift band and come back as low as I can and try and get back up. And by setting yourself all these little tasks and challenges, you're improving your glider control, your skill level, and your threshold for making decisions on the fly in a pretty safe environment. So when we move on to XC, if that's your choice, which we'll talk about later, you've already got this good fundamental layer of skills that you can take to another location. So flying tips for, beginner and advanced, they're very different, but if you follow the same route, you can get to the same place and then fly pretty much anywhere in the world in those conditions and have no surprises, because all these things you will have done on your home site. Anything you want to add, Guy?
So once you've got that mastered, you might want to do an SIV before you go inland.
I'm sorry, buddy. You cut out a fair amount then. I didn't get all of what you were saying.
Would you like to go inland flying cross country?
Okay, I just got the last bit. I think you're saying to move on to how to progress to inland. Is that correct? All right. I think you've been downloading too much of Netflix. You've frozen on me. So let me sort of make the executive choice, and let's talk about progression to XC, and then we'll talk about value of SIV, and then maybe. Yeah, I think you're coming across.
Turn your video off, and then your audio will work.
You got your hotspot on? Turn it off. Hang on, we're just fixing some things. Right, we're not sure if Chris's hotspot's interfering with the Wi-Fi, so we're just getting rid of that. But yes, Roger, can you talk to us about maybe why you should look at doing an SIV as you start to transition to going inland?
Well, certainly. You don't have to have done an SIV before you go inland, and you don't have to do an SIV full stop. So, you could go into inland with minimal skills. The important thing about going inland is knowing the conditions and knowing yourself. So let's talk about the value of SIV, which you mentioned, Guy, and then we'll talk to progression to XC. So one of the big questions people always ask me is why do SIV and what's the benefit to me? And they often think, I've never lost control of my glider. I've been flying for 6 years or however many years. Why should I do an SIV? Because I can control my glider. And for those people that can justify say that, they're right. Possibly they can keep the glider open and controlled the entire time. But the real benefit to doing an SIV is you learn how to recognize the different configurations of your glider flying. So normally when you fly, it is always above your head, and that is the configuration you recognize. But if it collapses asymmetrically or symmetrically or starts to have a cascading element because of your inputs, these are now flight configurations that you've never seen before. And recognizing what to make it fly again. So SIV is incredibly simple. And I'll give you a little rundown of SIV right now. For SIV, basically, all we're ever doing is teaching you your hands down, but nothing else. Because this is what causes the cascades. So really what are we doing is we're recognizing the flight configuration of the glider and then up or down according to what we need to do to get the glider to refly so we can regain.
We've lost you, Roger. It's frozen, unfortunately.
And when you need to deploy the reserve.
Roger, we lost that last 15 seconds or so. We got about putting your hands, and then after that you froze for a sec. So if you can go back to where you were talking about where your hands are, what you teach with your hands. I think it was the hands up.
I can do this all day, Jeff. So yeah, so basically what I'm saying is, basically with SIV, all we do is teach you to put your hands up or down. Okay, we never bring our hands up and down, as this is what causes the cascading problems for pilots. So the real value of SIV is that you can recognize the configuration of your glider in flight and then make the correct brake inputs to regain control. The other benefit of the value of SIV is that you will recognize when the glider is now out of control and when you should deploy your reserve. because the sooner you throw your reserve, the sooner it can get up, open above your head. You can depower the main glider and land safely under it. So those are the two values of SOV. You know, SOV is one of those things that your glider has been certified to this level, and you flying it, whether it's an A wing, a B wing, a C, or a D, you know, it doesn't matter if your mate says, oh, you're flying that Ozone Delta 4, that's a handful. No, it's not. That is a C wing, and it has C characteristics. And as long as you are a pilot that can recognize the flight configuration, you have the skill to open it up. So the value of SOV is to recognize the flight configuration of your glider and to give you the confidence that you know you can control the wing regardless of what happens when it's above your head. And when you take away that level of fear of what if this happens, what if that happens, and you realize that if this happens, that's really not bad. I just put my hands up or I weight shift away. Well, that's not a big worry. So you turn that negative energy into positive and you continue the fly. You know, often you'll hear a pilot saying, oh, it was too turbulent. I took a collapse. I just didn't like it. And I flew away from the climb. And that possibly could have just been negative energy. And they were worried about the later outcome of what if they had a collapse versus thinking about the positive of there's turbulence here, which means that there is hot air and cold air mixing. And I'm going to use the positive energy to focus on the climb out, and continue my XC. So, you know, the value of XC, lots of things. It should give you confidence in your wing, confidence in your ability, and recognizing what the wing is doing at all times. How's that? Good selling point? I say the...
so once you've done your SIV?
Yeah, so, well...
So once you've done your SIV, with or without Jockey Sanderson, you...
Sorry, mate, I listened to the last bit. Once you've done the SIV without...
Don't think your internet is...
you might go inland.
I think you might have to take over moderation, Jeff. I'm only getting every second word from Guy.
Yeah, same here. But I think he's saying once you've finished SIV, then going inland. I wanted to ask you a common question I get is it scary? Is it scary to do a SIV?
Well, look, I think if you're a nervous pilot, doing SIV might not be a good thing for you. If you're a nervous pilot, you're better to get positive experiences, and you'll get that from flying in conditions that are suitable to your level. Having that what do they call it, irrational fear, well, that's a great time to do SIV, because we will teach you that the irrational fear is nothing to be feared. But if you rock up to a flying site and the whole time you're shitting yourself, oh, why am I doing this? I don't know if I should do this. Then SIV might not be the best idea for you. But regardless of which SIV course you do, whether it's one of mine, whether one we do with Jockey or the other instructors in Australia, the SIV course should be tailored to the individual pilot. So you can rock up to any of our courses and you could say, look, I don't want to stall a wing. I don't want to do a spiral, but what I really want to do is just learn how to control collapses. And we can take you through those stages. A proper educated SIV instructor shouldn't make you do anything that you're not ready for and something that you haven't progressed along the right line. So by the time you do that maneuver, you've done the 3 steps prior that you know what you're doing.
Cool. We've got a question from Phil, I think, as well. Phil, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, Roger. It's about when you're deploying your reserve. When you're trying to depower the wing, I read in the recent article that you kindly put in the magazine, by combing the Ds. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that? About, like, are you doing multiple combing on just on the collapse side, or is it just a big sharp? Can you elaborate a bit more?
Definitely. So the reason we switched from the A's to the D's is because of the shark nose technology that almost all gliders are using now. And as they've moved the A lines further away from the trailing edge, it gets more and more physical to pull the A's. And we found that pilots just weren't physically able to create that initial collapse. And then even when they did make the collapse, because you're pulling on the A's, the air is still constantly trying to penetrate through the cell openings. So it's quite a physical pull. So we switched the focus to the D's. So most pilots will have seen the way a tandem top lands in strong wind, especially when there's a helper and the helper takes the brakes and they run backwards and it pulls the leading edge down out of the relative airflow, and then it's easy for the glider to be held at that point versus constantly being pulled against you. So the idea of combing the D's is the same thing, that we're creating such a sharp angle of attack when we pull down that the leading edge drops right out of the relative airflow, and then it's a very simple pull down. So the way we do it is if you look at your rear malleons, so where your brakes are, you look up your rear malleons, most gliders will have 3 lines there. So you put your 3 fingers, like we call it the dragon's claw, and you place it so there's 1 line on each side of the finger. So you get a really good strong grip and you give it 1 hard pull down. Bang! What it does is it pulls the leading edge right back and no more relative airflow can come into the cells. And then from there, it is a very simple pull. There is almost no pressure. You're just pulling on the rear lines. That's it, nothing else, until you get the trailing edge in your hand. It is so unphysical that you can just let go with 1 hand and hold the glider there. When done quickly, it can be completely depowered within 10 seconds. And when I teach parachute repacking, I show a video just how easy it is to be done. So typically I say to people, you know, it all depends on why you threw the reserve. So from level flight, it's never a good example. But say you were in a curvated spiral and you threw your reserve. As the reserve opened, that might be enough energy that the glider then falls in front and deflates. And if it deflates in front of you, it's a gift. Grab your A's or whatever line's there and just keep pulling it in until it's in your hand. But if you throw your reserve and the glider is still right out in front of you and the leading edge is facing down to the ground, just come straight back to those rear malleons, good hard pull down, and then bring those lines in until you have the cloth by your hands. If you can't pull in the D's that way, combing the D's, because for whatever reason, you have to do something to depower the main. You cannot leave your glider reacting against the reserve because the glider will start to downplane. And especially if there was any sort of rotation, say a curvated spiral, you'll then start to get really fast rotational forces. So your reserve, rather than sitting above your head, will be back behind your head and you'll be swinging around the reserve. So not only will you have a descent rate that could be 10 or 11 meters per second, but you're also oscillating. So you could hit the ground at 14 or 15 meters a second. So it is not an option to leave your main outside. So if you can't use the D's and the A's don't work, your last option is to take your brakes. And all you do is you lock your arms down like you're doing a stall. And with your arms fully straight, you just wrap the brake lines around your hands. And you will effectively do the same thing as combing the lines, where you'll pull the leading edge at such a sharp angle that no air can come in. And then from there, you just start pulling on the brake lines. And once you've got the brake lines into your hand, again, once it's collapsed, there's no pull left on the glider. There's no air can come through the cells. So just hold it with 1 hand above the pulleys, shake out the lines around your hand, grip it with the other side, and then you can come down with no lines around the small digits of your fingers or your hands, which could cause a problem if you went into trees and then that started to restrict the blood flow to your small extremities.
Awesome, Roger. Thank you. That was awesome.
Pleasure.
Just a really quick comment. Roger, thank you. You know, you're covering like obviously coastal flying, inland flying, and we're now onto SIV. If anyone's got a question at the end of any of those topics, I guess we've gone into the third one by now, but, you know, obviously please feel free to raise your hand and chime in with a question there. So again, I think Jeff explained at the start, but if you kind of just wave your mouse and look at the bottom of the screen, you've got all the icons with your microphone and your camera. There is a raised hand icon. If you just click on that, you'll be able to, it'll pop up in the chat for it. So if I may, Roger, I've got a quick question. I'm very, very keen, as you said, to do an SIV this year. So do you have any coming up?
Yeah, so what I'm not going to lie to you, Scott. It's been a terrible year for SIV for two things. One was the drought that took all the water out of all the lakes. And the second one was the bushfires, which then had helicopters flying and we couldn't operate. So we haven't done a great deal. We've run 1 in February and then 3 in March. We are hoping to run them. We try and run. So the way I do it is I run these SIVs. It's a small group, 4 pilots every 2 months on a weekend. And that way we have a bad weather weekend. So if the weather's bad on one weekend, we just postpone it to the other. Because there's only 4 pilots, we can do the entire SIV in one day. But what we try and do is spread it out over a day and a half. And that way there's less stress for the pilots and more time we can give to you guys participating with briefs and debriefs. So as of September, we'll start doing it again every 2 months, providing COVID and the world gone mad is okay. And chatting with Jockey, we're looking at doing them again next year in March. But that will then be determined by the travel restrictions from the UK to here. So we're hoping that, but we'll do it again with him. But it's a strange world we're living in. Who knows?
Yeah, fingers crossed. I know that the bushfires wiped out cross-country flying for all of us. Myself and some other pilots drove down to Bright. Bright was covered in smoke, and we tried to go to Corryong, and Corryong got evacuated. This is all around Christmas time, and then a lot of tow clinics I know have been called off this year due to the extremely dry conditions and dust devils and what have you. Inland.
Yeah, so I was trying to run a cross-country clinic at the same time you were referring to around Bright and Corryong, and we ended up going to Lake Sinclair, and usually it never works in summer because we get the strong sea breezes. But for 4 days, we had this window where the wind was light, and when the sun came up after midday, it would block the sea breeze, and then we would get off and then fly into the valley. But it was very dry, and it's the only time the only place I've ever seen a poo devil. So they had cows up and launched that had shit, and when the dust devils went through, it picked up the poo and made a poo devil. And I jumped on the lady's glider and got hit in the face with poo. So you've got it all on your doorstep right in the Hunter Valley. There you go.
I think Guy or Chris has raised a hand. Guy,
thanks, Scott. Yes. If you haven't experienced the joy of a full...
Guy, you might have to mute your micro.
We recommend it. It's very exciting. Roger, can you tell us a little bit about...
So apologies, everyone, for the technical difficulties tonight. Guy, we're just getting a lot of frame drops and the audio dropping out, mate. I'm really sorry.
Neil's got a question. Neil, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. Roger, I'm just interested because I spoke to Jockey a couple of hours ago, and he said one of the requirements for your SIV course is a tow endorsement. For those of us who don't have tow endorsements, when is the next tow endorsement course? What we're finding up here in Queensland is most of our paragliding instructor schools have closed down and there's not an instructor in sight. So if you can advise on any courses that you're doing, tow or anything really, we are keen for those dates. I've had a look on your website and I haven't found, when I clicked on the calendar, it was ineffectual.
Yeah, so apologies about that. This will be the first time in 5 years that I'm not running cross-country in Europe at this time. So I usually set the calendar in August for the next complete season. Regarding the tow courses, we run them about every 2 to 3 months, usually from Gloucester. We can travel, but that could be a long way for you to come down to. So we do offer tow endorsement training with SIV training. But it requires a bit of homework where you'll need to do some revisions and things like that beforehand. And then we do a theory exam before we do any talk of SIV training, and then we tow you up 3 or 4 times across the lake, just straight line tows to get you used to towing, and then you finish your tow endorsement course doing the SIV tows. But that isn't the best way I recommend it, as I'm sure Guy or Phil or some of the guys have done it with me. SIV on itself can be quite stressful, and trying to learn a new discipline like towing on its own can put too much stress on a pilot, which then decreases their performance curve. So I'd say if you have the chance to do a tow endorsement beforehand, but we get a lot of guys coming from New Zealand, then there's no towing there, so that's how we often do it with them. So there is the option to tow endorse you at SIV, but if not, we run the courses in the short term. And there certainly was a guy up near you called Shane who was running them fairly frequently, but I don't know if he still is.
Yeah, Shane's my instructor who's just taken me through PG2. Shane's hibernated because of COVID-19. And in fact, a lot of instructors up here, I don't know if you know Jason Turner, he's Paratech. He's about the only school that's running at the moment, and there's sort of a month's wait list for just per day training.
Right.
So we're quite happy to travel, have car. We'll go very far away to try to find any courses.
Okay, well, look, I'll drop you an email later, because if you have some people that want to do it, we don't have to wait till September. We can do it in Gloucester or closer to the field, but we can chat about that. But yeah, it's not an issue. We will get you towing, and once you can tow, you can do SIV, you can do acro, or you can do the really fun stuff of going to the middle of nowhere like Dolby, which is great for cross country. And then if you bomb out, there's no hiking back up a hill. You just walk to the car and try again. So the world's your oyster, my friend. We just got to get you towing first.
Thanks very much.
And with that, Roger, do you want to talk a little bit about inland, XC safaris, cross-country tips?
Great. All right. We're churning and burning now. Let me take my top off. I have an ongoing fight with my wife about the heater in the house. I prefer to put jackets on. She likes to heat the house. I pay the electricity bill. She doesn't. But I'm warming up. So progression to XC. So it's very easy to go cross-country and very easy to thermal, but it's very hard if you haven't mastered one skill beforehand. So my recommendation to you is if you live on the coast, you should do as we spoke about before with the coastal tips and really dial in and master coastal flying, because it's in the environment that you live in, and the more control you have of your glider and the less fear you have of taking off in strong winds or landing in strong winds will set you up later for progression to XC. The other great thing about coastal flying is you can practice all sorts of things which will then help you when you go thermal flying and XC flying. And the number one thing is glider control. So when you thermal fly, you're trying to keep the glider above your head and as flat turning in thermals as you can. But usually you don't do a great deal of movement with your brakes, especially going towards minimum sync, which are all skills that you will do when you coastal fly and especially when you top land. So the more proficient you are at top landing, the better glider control skills you will have, which will then relay onto your thermal and cross-country flying. The other things to do before you even go to your cross-country site is to get your glider and your harness and your instruments set up in a manner that when you go cross-country, you are familiar with them, because familiarity is the key. And many pilots have landed because, damn it, that barrier was just in a spot where I couldn't see it. So when you're at the coast and you have all this time to fly in your favorite spot, especially if you know you're going to go a cross-country trip or some thermal flying soon, is to take all your gear, get flying, position it on your cockpit. Can you read it? Can you hear it? Can you read the different text boxes and do you know what they mean? And these are all things that you can do so that when you actually do go inland flying, the only thing you're thinking about is where is the lift, not what is my instrument saying or anything else. You are just focusing on the one task, which is making the most of the lift and then going on glide efficiently. So the things you can do before you even go XC is these things. The next thing is, especially if you're new to XC flying, is to get your school book out, your textbook, and start going through the theory. Because I can guarantee all of your instructors would have spent what seemed like an eternity on your PG2 course talking about where's the lift, thermal flying, flying in wind, alternate landing sites. But until you have some practical knowledge and practical experience, the information they give you is pretty much pointless. It just goes through your ear, you remember it for the test, you write it down, it's gone. So prior learning before XC, again, will help you perform better on the day. So get your book out, go through it. There are lots of videos online, but all these steps I'd suggest doing before you even rock up to the site, because the more knowledge you can have and the more prepared you are for the flights, the easier you'll find everything. The other top tip I would have for pilots on the coast progressing to XC is how to master active flying. Okay, so we've all heard this term active flying tossed about, but for most people, if you actually ask them, what do you think active flying is? You could get a variety of answers from 10% brake to 50% brake to hands up, but it doesn't really tell you what active flying is. And basically, active flying is keeping the glider above your head. It's not letting the glider go forwards. It's not letting the glider go to the side. It's keeping it directly above your head. So you might think, well, how can I practice this on the coast? Well, the best way to practice this is through ground handling. And what I like to do with my guys that we train with is I'll go to a flying site or a ground handling spot as long as it's laminar wind, and I'll take one of those folding camping chairs. I'm sure you've all got them. You're all paraglider pilots. We all have them. You take it to a launch site. So the idea is that you'll inflate the wing, control the wing at launch, and then sit down into your nice, comfortable camping chair. So your paraglider has pendular stability. So if your glider moves forwards, you swing underneath it, right? And to be efficient on glide, we need to keep the glider here, right? But when we're flying, we always have this option of swinging either side. And that's what kills our glide and it kills our performance. So how can we practice that on the coast? Well, by sitting down in these camping chairs, we no longer have pendular stability. The glider is moving around us because we are sitting down. Our weight isn't on the lines. So every time the glider moves forward or sideways either side, you have to make small inputs to keep the glider above your head. Now, a lot of you might be sitting there and thinking, oh, that sounds really simple. But it's only until you've done it that you'll realize that there is a fine art to glider control. And the more used you are to making these constant inputs, the less worried you're going to be when you fly in big air that's moving and the glider's moving everywhere, because you're used to constantly making these brake adjustments. So before you get even to the hill, I'd say, yeah, glider control, learn your glider, get into your books, revise, learn, go over the stuff you've had, practice your glider control sitting down, your active flying. And then from there, it is choose the weather and the flight location wisely. So if you're new to flying, you probably don't want to be taking off in the peak times of the day for your first flights. So if we are at Manila, for example, if you're launching between 12 and 3 o'clock, you could expect the thermals to be quite strong. And if there are strong thermals, there's also strong sink next to thermals, which can potentially provide for strong turbulence. So when you're progressing, try and pick the environment and the flying site that's going to give you the best experience. So when you're starting off, possibly choose to fly only later in the afternoon or early in the morning. And then as you have more success with your thermaling and your ability to maximize the lift, then move into, the more spicy times of the day. But, everyone talks about, injuries and flying and all the rest of it. But very few people talk about fear injuries, and fear injuries happen to all of us. And it could be because you've had an accident, or it could be because you've had a scare. But especially when you're starting off in your inland flying and XC flying, if you take a really big scare, and it might not be a big scare for a more experienced pilot, but for you, it scared you, it's going to start haunting you. And that fear injury can start playing on your performance curve. So really take the time to fly in the right conditions for you and the right site. After that, I would say the progression to XC, try and fly with people who are better pilots than you. So you've got these great clubs like the Central Coast that has a mentoring system. There are lots of instructors in other schools that have, you know, come fly with us days or XE clinics, but try and fly with people that are better than you, because, you know, humans are competitive by spirit, and naturally I'm going to rise to Guy's level if he's beating me and vice versa. Whereas if you're all at the same level, then you'll all just be bobbing around like bobbins, right? And no one is going to start making that a next step. So fly with better pilots with you. And the last tip I would say is to be patient and listen to your inner chimp, your inner monkey in your head. So first of all, be patient. Paragliding and free flight is an apprenticeship of the sky, and it takes time and experience to get good and to get safe. So I always use the analogy of driving a car. When you were on your L's, half an hour, you were spent. You wanted to get out of the driver's seat. However, 4 years down the track, you can drive Sydney to Canberra, no problem. Heck, you might even have a cigarette in your mouth. Another 8 years' time, you might be doing Brisbane to Gladstone, driving with your knees whilst eating a Big Mac, smoking a cigarette and a milkshake, right? It is experience that you are building on. So be patient. If you're a low airtime pilot, don't compare yourself to the local gun in your club, because he's put the hours of the apprenticeship in, all right? So fly with better people, but be patient and keep evaluating your skills. And listen to your inner chimp. You know, there is a part inside your brain that has been designed to get you out of danger, okay? There can be this fear of irrational fear. So it's good to have a good sound knowledge base to know what you're afraid of. But if your inner chimp is saying, don't do this, don't feel this day for whatever reason, don't be afraid to listen to it. Because, you know, our gut instincts are this primitive past that we have that is often, you know, that last resort to get us out of a hairy situation. So yeah, progression to XC. It's a good way of going. You can take someone that's almost never flown XC. If you take that progression, you will have a good time. You won't get scared, and you will develop skills quite quickly.
And then what happens when you get sick of Australia, Roger, and you go over to Europe?
Well, you better not get sick in the next 3 weeks, because there's no chance you're going anywhere. Yeah, so look, I mean, paragliding is this amazing thing that once you start, it's a drug you're addicted to, and you can travel with it. It's not a hang glider. It's not a glider plane. You stick it in your backpack and off you go. So I have been running trips to Europe since 2015. Closer field, there are places like New Zealand, which are great. The only downside to New Zealand is it shares the same season that we have. And if you look on flyable days, typically we have more flyable days than they do, but they have beautiful mountains and countryside. So, you know, the local sort of places that you could travel are anywhere in Australia. And I mean, even in Australia right now, if you're from Melbourne, it's COVID-ridden and cold. But if you travel to far north Queensland, you might have heat, sunshine, bikinis, bars, and 4 meter per second climbs. So you don't have to travel far afield to experience this great flight community and flight environment. But, you know, Europe is the paragliding like Hawaii is the surfers. And I say to anyone, the problem with going to Europe is you'll realize how shit we have it in Australia. Because Europe has the infrastructure, it has everything's close. You could think you're in the middle of nowhere and find that there's a bus to a nearest town, there's bars, there's everything there. So it is a very different world to what we have. And it's fantastic. You know, there really is, you know, there's nothing I can really equate to being 4,000 meters above a glacier and seeing a mountain go for another 600 meters and trying to find the scrabs of lift to jump over the 4,600 meter mountain to get into the valley behind. I mean, it is just fantastic. So I would suggest to all paraglide pilots to make sort of the Mecca pilgrimage, if you will, to Europe at some stage in your career. But the more experience you have, the more you will enjoy it. Because it's the same thing we talked about. We could take you up in the morning and the afternoon, and you'll have a great time. But the more experience you have with flying, with thermaling, with cross country, the more you will be able to see of the mountains. And, you know, there's something very sweet about taking off in a different country and landing your paraglider in another country and eating the local food, a beer, and taking the train back, or having someone pick you up. So my Europe trips, I always run them in June. And the reason for June is that it is sort of the lay-by season. The best cross-country flying in Europe is usually in the spring. But in April and May, you get rain. April showers, May showers. June is closer to the summer. However, you get the better weather towards the summer. So you typically get the best thermic conditions for XC with the best chance of nice weather for a long period block. The other reason we picked June over the other months is that as of the 10th of July, every school in the Northern Hemisphere will at some stage have an overlapping period of school holidays. So the roads get absolutely chocked. They mark the price up for lifts, for hotels, and all the rest of that stuff. So we picked June for that reason, for the weather and for the ease to move from sites. We choose a place called Stubai, the Stubai Valley, which is just north of Innsbruck, for those that know. And the reason we choose there is it's a central spot. It sits right behind the main divide of the Alps. So from here, if the weather, say we have South Fern, which makes flying in Austria impossible, it's dangerous, we can drive 90 minutes into the Dolomites to fly. If Italy has North Fern and it's raining in Austria, we can drive 90 minutes into Bavaria to fly. And just within this one spot in Austria, there are probably 15 classic flying sites within an hour to drive. So this is why I've chosen this location. And the least amount of days we've ever flown are 8 out of 10. The last 2 years, we've done 10 out of 10 days. And Guy came with us with Chrissy and Phil in 2016, which was the worst weather we ever had. And they still flew 8 out of 10. So, you know, by all means, I'm not trying to sell you to come to Europe with me. Just when you are ready, broaden your horizons and you'll have a great time.
And Switzerland's even better, isn't that right, Phil?
Switzerland. Very pretty, very expensive. But, you know, you could throw a rock anywhere in those main areas and you'll find a perfect spot. Slovenia is great. France is great. The biggest issue that I found with people is they say, can't we go here and here and here? And, you know, from Austria to Annecy is a 9-hour drive. So, you know, although you think Europe's quite small, because of the mountain range, it can take a long time. And then if you're only there for 10 days, we always figured it's the best to put ourselves in the best location to fly every day versus losing days to travel from one location to another. But Switzerland's good, and you can hit Switzerland and France, or here, Guy, wherever you like, mate.
Yeah.
World's your oyster.
Did you learn a lot and you get your skills up and you meet some great people as you go, as we know? Shall we open it up to questions? I think everyone can actually hear me now, can't they, Jeff and Scott?
You've come good, mate. Hey, just really quickly, Roger, I've had the pleasure of flying Europe as well. Did you want to maybe really quickly explain those Fern Winds for those that would perhaps not be familiar with what they are?
Yeah, certainly. So the Fern Wind, it sounds like fun, but it isn't fun. Fern in German means hairdryer. And basically it is when there's a buildup of pressure of one side of the main divide. So the Alps are broken up by a divide of mountains that runs east-west. So you have a north side and a south side. And when too much, well, they measure by hectopascals, but it's typically too much moisture is on one side of the mountain, it can't just flow easily from the south to the north or vice versa. So typically the pressure builds up and builds up and builds up, and they measure the Fern from the difference of the Alps on one side to the other. And at some point, the Fern breaks over the main chain and then sort of starts flowing down in this horrific turbulent wind. So the Fern, the areas that are most affected by the Fern are the ones that are closest to the main divide. So, for instance, when it's South Fern, you cannot fly in Austria. But if it's really strong South Fern, that South Fern can push even 120 kilometers north up into Germany. So typically, Fern isn't a big thing, and you can fly South Fern in Italy, and there are places in Germany and even in Austria where you can fly South Fern and vice versa with North Fern, but you just need to know what the deal is with Fern, what the strength is, and where you're at risk and where you're not. Because we can't see what we're flying in, and if you could put on magic glasses and see the Fern rolling through like breakers on a beach, you probably wouldn't choose to take off.
Yeah, thank you, mate. Yeah. Do we have any questions, guys? Anyone want to throw a question at Roger? All right, well, just a very quick one, mate. You said you started, or you did acro in your earlier years. Did you do acro before you ever did an SIV, or did you start doing acro and realize I need to do some SIV?
No, well, I mean, so I started off like anyone. I lived in Sydney, and pretty quick, going back and forth didn't cut it. So I tried wingovers, and pretty quickly the wingovers got big enough to scare the shit out of me. And I was lucky; I never lost control. But I realized that there was this big layer that I didn't know. So then I started going to places like Blackheath and North Brother and pulling on lines to see what would happen. And then that really, really showed me that I was on a downward path if I continued this. So I actually contacted Jockey. We'd never met in 2010 and said, I want to run an SIV course because I want to do acro. What will it take us to run an SIV course in Australia? And I'll learn from you. And he set out some guidelines that need to be done. And I did them. I said, all right, so let's plan some dates. And we did that. And from then on in, we started running SIV. So the first SIV course, I wouldn't say I mastered stalls, but I at least got the basics down for the things that I really didn't know. And, you know, people think acro is dangerous, but acro is actually very safe. And I've had far scarier moments cross-country flying ever than acro. Because with acro, you can set yourself a progression. And once you've mastered one skill, you move on to the next. And if you do it that way, yes, it gets exciting, but it never gets terrifying because you've learnt the step beforehand. Whereas cross-country flying, I have found myself in places where suddenly there was much more wind than I thought. And I thought, if I can't penetrate, I'm going down into this horrific area beneath me. And, you know, that is terrifying. So, you know, I think there's far more risk in cross-country flying, especially cross-country with the blinkers on, not knowing why you're doing things, than there ever is with acro or SIV.
Yeah, mate, excellent. Thank you. I think we've got a question from Matt. We had a raised hand for Matt. Go ahead, Matt. Oh, no, Matt's, I think we've lost Matt. But there's another raised hand here. Who's that? Neil. Go ahead, mate.
Roger, if we're looking to progress from, say, coastal flying to flying inland, are there any sort of harness and reserve requirements that you would advise? Like, is a reserve really... At the moment, I don't fly with a reserve, and I've been told if I go fly inland, it is 9 times out of 10, everybody would say you need a reserve.
Well, I wouldn't say you need a reserve. I'd say that's your choice. You're the pilot. Your reserve is your only get-out-of-jail card. So if you choose not to fly it, just know that you don't have a get-out-of-jail card. So I'd recommend you've used one, but it's up to you. Regarding reserves, choose a round or a hybrid. Don't worry about a Rogallo. For cross country, they're not that great. And with a harness, anything that is EN certified that you are happy with. So if you've probably got a harness that you learnt with in school.
Yeah, so with Shane, he's a Nivea distributor, so that's all good. It's just unfortunate I learned in New Zealand, and as part of learning, we were given hike and fly harnesses without a seat plate, and I found that going into thermic conditions, it can be, for PG2, it can be a little bit unnerving not having a seat plate or a reserve.
Well, you're listening to your inner chimp. It's saying don't do it. So, yeah, look, I'd say get a reserve, and I would strongly recommend getting a harness that has a seat board, because a seat board does two things. Well, it does three things. The first thing it does is it gives you better weight shift, because as you move your hips from one side to the other, the board creates the difference in carabiner height, which is way more effective than a hammock seat where you raise a bum cheek, but the carabiner barely moves. So you'll have more effective weight shift with a seat board. The second thing you will have is more feedback from the glider. So, often people fly hammock style harnesses, and they say, oh, it's so much more comfortable than flying my seat board. I don't feel the turbulence. But they're also not feeling the feedback that the air is giving throughout this period. So that's another reason. And the third reason I always want a seat board in my gear is that if I go into trees, which I've never done, but I'm not going to rule it out. If I go into trees, I want something to stop a branch penetrating my backside and my insides, and that is given by a seat board. So get yourself a seat board certified harness and get yourself a reserve, and you will then probably take some of this negative fear that you've had of thinking of flying inland and put it positively to where's the lift and getting up.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much.
Excellent. We've got a raised hand. I think Matt's rejoined us in the conference. Matt, go ahead, mate.
Yeah, cheers. Looks like there's some really great work sort of being done up around Wattigans, and I know there's sort of a working bee up there this weekend. Just wanted to get a sense of, when's the sort of best sort of flying conditions up there, what the sort of the XC sort of potential is, just from anyone really.
Well, I can give you my 2 cents worth, and then you can open up to the forum. It's old hang glider sites. Guys used to fly it in the late 2000s. The issues were always the glide to LZs. And I put Royce onto this 2 years ago, and he is just a marvelous man who's really tirelessly worked to get it going. So he takes all the credit for it. Flying sites, there's a nor'wester, a nor'easter, and a sou'easter. So the nor'west is only good for winter because you can't fly back to the coast because you get airspace. So really you're looking at northeast and southeast for cross country. The northwest is great for boating around, and you might fly to Maitland or whatever, but it's not big XC. The northeast and southeast is going to work best in spring, summer. The issue with the Hunter Valley is always that the sea breeze comes racing through in the afternoon. So the northeast or the southeast is the best option because it's east facing. The sun will be down there from sort of 5:30 in the morning, but the nor'east will have more direct sunlight in the south. So you'd want to be starting early, getting up and trying to be getting past the heavily forested area around Cessnock and Kurri when the wind arrives and starts blowing you up the valley.
Yeah, right.
We do have some new landing zones that are closer to launch too, by the way, so it's a lot safer, and they'll hopefully be re-rated in a few weeks.
Sounds
Excellent.
great. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Well, we need lots of people up there to take all the roots out. So, do your bit for the team, mate.
Any other questions? Any other thoughts, Roger? What's it like tandem paragliding with your daughter? Mine won't do it.
It's fantastic. I think it was the year after you were there, Guy, but I did a hike and fly with my daughter. We tried to raise money for charity. We did a 2,800 meter mountain and fly down. but now she's turning 6 in August, and she started to actually fly the glider. So the issue is that her arms aren't strong enough to do a lot of flying on the tandem because it's quite heavy. So she gets about 10 or 15 minutes, but yeah, she's starting to get into it, and it's just it's an amazing thing a father can share with a daughter. So who knows how long she wants to do it, but she loves being the center of attention, and all eyes are up when she flies at the sites in Sydney. So who knows? Watch this space.
We need more women flyers.
About Stanford, Roger, has she been up yet?
She hasn't. We were hoping to do it in Europe this time around, but yeah, the dream is, you know, like taking a cable car up a mountain and then walking 2 hours to a destination, and then the 4 of us flying down under the one glider, because we'll be under the minimum weight range. So it's happy days.
Oh,
4 of you on one glider.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. As long as the last one doesn't get airsick, or the first one, otherwise we'll...
Oh, wow. Okay, if we've got no more questions, we might leave it there. Thanks for everyone for joining and dialing in. We are posting these talks on the Central Coast Sky Surfers website down the track. We'll let you know when that happens. And we'll then hopefully at SAFA to recognise that we've got them on our site as a resource for people. Everyone's provided some different information, and just by listening to all the speakers, I think we've even learned a lot. So Jeff, Phil, Scott, anyone from Central Coast got anything else to add?
Well, I just wanted to say, if everyone could kindly unmute their microphones for a moment and give Roger a round of applause. Thank you, mate.
It's been a pleasure. Lovely to see some of you, and hope to meet you in the air sometime soon.
Thanks, Roger.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers, guys. See you, Roger.
Thank you, Rog.
Bye.
Bye.